In our previous episode, we discussed Oswald's interaction with the U.S. Embassy in Russia, including some communications from the embassy that either showed foreknowledge that Oswald would soon be arriving at the embassy or was just a huge coincidence. Which is possible. We also got into the question of why the CIA delayed the opening of a 201 file on Oswald. Even though the CIA determined that Oswald was important enough to be one of about 300 people who had their mail opened and read by the FBI and the CIA through Project H.T. Lingual, there was no clear answer as to exactly why the 201 file was delayed, other than the fact that James Angleton, the CIA's head of counterintelligence, was involved in the matter, according to other people in the CIA who worked with Angleton. We're not completely certain what all of that means at this point, but it's not nothing. We also briefly discussed the decision by the Soviets to relocate Oswald to the city of Minsk. This city is about 9 hours southwest of Moscow in Belarus, which, at that time, was a part of the Soviet Union. In this episode, we pick up with Oswald in Minsk. We'll look into how his relationship with Marina began, and whether Marina was a KGB asset, and we'll revisit what American defector Robert Webster said about Marina. On March the 17th, 1961, about 14 months after Oswald first arrived in Minsk, he met 19-year-old pharmacology student Marina Persakova at a trade union dance. Marina had moved to Minsk from Leningrad in 1960 to live with her aunt and uncle. Before she moved, she spent some time in Moscow, where she had a Moroccan exchange student boyfriend named Mohammed Rabab. Rabab had recently broken up with Marina before she met Oswald. According to Oswald's diary, he asked Marina if he could walk her home after the trade union dance, and he did walk her home, along with 5 other guys. Oswald's diary entry says, quote, "We liked each other right away. She gave me her phone number, and departs home with a not-so-new friend in a taxi. I walk home." Wait, a not-so-new friend? It sounds like Oswald's diary is saying she ditched him and took a taxi home with one of the other 5 guys who were trying to walk her home. Now, whether she was just friends with this guy or if something more was going on is unknown. But that's not exactly a romantic first meeting for her and Oswald. Aside from Oswald obtaining Marina's phone number, it doesn't seem like he made a big impression on her when they first met. I mean, she did leave with another guy after all. So how did they end up getting married? Marina told the HSCA in 1978 that she first spoke to Lee after the dance when they were invited for tea at a gathering at someone's house. But that's not consistent with what Lee's diary says. It's also not consistent with what Marina told reporter and former CIA asset Priscilla Johnson. In the book that they co-wrote together entitled Marina and Lee, in the book Marina says that Oswald was in the hospital on March 25th and she got a call to come and visit him there. But records from the 4th Clinical Hospital in Minsk show that Oswald was admitted to the hospital on Thursday, March 30th after complaining of pain in his throat. He then had his tonsils removed and stayed at the hospital until April 11th. Curiously, when he was questioned by doctors, Oswald said that he never had any type of venereal disease, which we know is not true, given the records of his treatment for gonorrhea while he was in Atsugi. But maybe Oswald was just too embarrassed to admit it. Who knows? Given that he was in the hospital for 12 days, we would expect Oswald to either not have any diary entries for those periods, or if there are diary entries, we would expect them to mention the fact that he was in the hospital. If you're writing about your life and you've been in the hospital for more than a week, you would probably mention that fact in the diary. But Oswald's diary doesn't mention anything at all about him being in the hospital, even though there are diary entries that cover the period of time that he was there. There's an entry for March 13th through the 31st that says, quote, "We walk, I talk a little about myself. She talks a lot about herself. Her name is Marina Persakova." An entry for April 1st through April 30th says, quote, "We are going steady and I decide I must have her. She puts me off, so on April 15th I propose. She accepts." At the time, couples who wanted to get married in Minsk were required to file a notice with the government 10 days before the wedding. Despite Oswald saying he proposed on April 15th, documents from the registrar's office in Minsk show that Marina and Lee filed a notice of intent to marry on April 10th, which is 1 day before Lee is released from the hospital and 5 days before he says he proposed. Once again, we have a conflict between Oswald's diary and other known facts. It does seem to make a certain amount of sense that if you were in the hospital, you would probably stop writing in your diary, especially if that diary was still sitting on a bureau or dresser back at your house. But that's not what happened here. Lee did write diary entries where the medical records show that he was in the hospital, so he must have had his diary with him when he entered the hospital, or he had someone bring it to him while he was there. And this is when Marina says she got to know Lee. But, for whatever reason, Oswald left out the part about all of this happening while he was in the hospital. On top of that, Lee would have had to propose to Marina before they filed this notice to Mary on April 10th. But he says he didn't propose until April 15th. Of course, people get dates wrong all the time, but you would think that dates in a written diary would be pretty accurate. All of these conflicts tend to undercut the credibility of Oswald's diary. It's almost as if it was created by someone else to fashion a certain narrative, but I may just be looking at it all through jaded lenses. Marina and Lee got married on April 30th, 1961, about 6 weeks after they met at the dance. Marina and Lee were not alone a single time prior to them being married. To some, that might seem weird, but that's how it happened. People get together in strange ways that don't make sense to others all the time. But still, something seems a little off about Lee and Marina's relationship. Some researchers have explained their relationship as Oswald being on the rebound from being rejected by Ella German, although Oswald did date Nelia in between Ella and Marina. And others have said that Marina never had a home of her own, and she wanted to live in Oswald's fancy apartment. Whatever the case may be, they did get married, and eventually had 2 children. The rapid speed with which they met and got married has led to a lot of speculation that Marina could have been a Soviet KGB asset. Now, there are no declassified KGB files that prove Marina was an agent. The possibility that she was is worth exploring, especially given that a few pieces of information that have come out over the years merit further scrutiny. When Marina moved to Minsk, she moved in with her uncle Ila, who was a high-ranking member of the Communist Party and a colonel in the MVD, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs. This organization worked closely with the KGB. That doesn't prove that Marina was KGB, but it is a direct connection. Perhaps even more profound than Marina's uncle being loosely tied to the KGB is a declassified CIA document from Oswald's 201 file entitled Indications of Intelligence Involvement by Marina Oswald. In that document, the CIA lists 29 potential reasons to believe that Marina was affiliated with the KGB. Here are just a few of those 29 examples. The mystery of her father could be a cover story to hide her, quote, cover-damaging father. She refused her first job assignment and had no negative consequences. She took vacations and ate out at restaurants without having much money to support herself. Her uncle must have been important since he had a VIP apartment in Minsk. And her surprisingly quick decision to marry an ill-tempered foreigner. In addition to all of that, there is a declassified memo from Thomas Kasazian of the CIA's Soviet Russia Division from November 25, 1963, just a few days after the assassination. And that memo says that Kasazian wanted to talk to Oswald while he was in Russia, but he never had the chance to. One of the reasons he wanted to speak to Oswald was because there was a trend of Soviet women marrying foreigners and then divorcing them when they were back in the spouse's home country. Some of these women ended up being tied to the KGB. Kasazian said he wanted to warn Oswald about the possibility that Marina could be a KGB honeypot plant, but Kasazian never ended up speaking to Oswald as far as we know. After the assassination, and after Jack Ruby killed Oswald, James H. Martin became Marina's business manager to help her navigate different potential offers for the purchase of her life story rights. Marina told Martin about her life before she met Lee. She said that she once entertained the ambassador of Afghanistan in his hotel room in Leningrad. She later told author Norman Mailer that the Afghan ambassador actually raped her. This begs the question of how Marina got into a position to be entertaining the ambassador of Afghanistan in a hotel room in Leningrad in the first place. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations called James Martin to testify, and he began telling the story about Marina and the Afghan ambassador, the interview was stopped, and those comments were stricken from the record. Yuri Mineski told Norman Mailer that he knew both Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina in Minsk. He claimed that Marina got in trouble for always hanging around the Hotel Leningrad, and that she was sent away from Leningrad to Minsk because of prostitution with a foreigner. So who was Yuri Mineski? Yuri Mineski is the man that introduced Lee Harvey Oswald to Marina at the trade union dance, according to what Marina herself told the Warren Commission and the FBI. So Mineski is not just some random person. And remember Robert Webster, Oswald's fellow defector to the Soviet Union in 1959, claimed to have met Marina at a trade show in Moscow when she lived in Leningrad. And he says that Marina spoke English when the Warren report says that Marina spoke little, if any, English. Now, this information does not prove that Marina was KGB, but we should certainly consider that possibility in light of all these different endpoints connecting. I mean, we have her uncle's affiliations, her interest in foreign men, and the existence of a Soviet honeypot expatriate divorce scheme that was already identified by the CIA, and the 29 reasons why the CIA thought that Marina might be a KGB agent or at least an asset. On May 16, 1961, Oswald wrote to the U.S. Embassy to inform them that he was now married and that he wanted a full guarantee of immunity from prosecution before traveling to Moscow. The United States State Department interviewed both Marina and Lee in July of 1961 in person at the embassy in Moscow. It was then determined that Oswald never renounced his citizenship. This meant that he could come back to the United States. Remember, Oswald didn't fill out the proper paperwork, and he didn't visit the embassy on a business day, thereby bypassing his renouncement of citizenship in what I had mentioned earlier was a pretty slick side door trick. Oswald told them that he never spoke to Russian authorities and never divulged any military secrets to them. American counsel Richard Snyder said in his report, quote, Oswald indicated anxiety as to whether he would face possible lengthy imprisonment, but the State Department instructed Snyder to, quote, not give any assurances one way or the other about prosecution. By the summer of 1961, the wheels were in motion for Marina and Lee to leave the Soviet Union for the United States. Lee still had to get an exit visa from the USSR, and Marina had to get permission from both the USSR and the United States. While they waited for a decision, and for much of the rest of 1961, they were living in Minsk, where everyone knew that they were trying to leave for America, and they became social pariahs. Marina finally received the Soviet travel approval on Christmas Day of 1961, but she still needed her American visa. On January 5, 1962, Oswald wrote to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow asking for a loan for travel expenses back to the United States. The embassy responded on January 15th that Oswald needed to provide evidence that Marina wouldn't become a public charge in the United States, and that he should do so through an affidavit of support by one of his close relatives. Before I began this deep dive into Oswald's time in Russia, I always thought the loan from the State Department was a big deal. Turns out it's a fairly common practice for travelers who may be stuck in some foreign country for whatever reason. But this particular circumstance certainly wasn't just some random traveler stuck in a foreign country. This was a failed defector who had previously stated that he was going to give up classified military secrets to the Soviet Union. On January 26th, the State Department sent a memo to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that Marina could not come to the United States. But the U.S. Embassy in Moscow either didn't get the memo, or they just flatly ignored it. Because after they received it, Embassy Counsel Joseph Norbury nevertheless wrote to Oswald, telling him that the embassy would accept his application for a loan. On March 9th, Embassy Counsel Newberry again wrote to Oswald, telling him that the embassy could offer a $500 loan as soon as Marina's visa was approved. For whatever reason, Norbury was continually ignoring the January 26th State Department memo about Marina's travel to the U.S. The basis for her failure to be approved was that immigrant visas were not permitted from the Soviet Union. For reasons that have never been explained, higher-ups at the State Department escalated the Marina Oswald case to the Immigration and Naturalization Service to bypass the law prohibiting Soviets from obtaining an immigration visa. On March 22nd, the Bureau of Consular Affairs at the State Department wrote to the INS Commissioner Raymond Ferral, urging him to reconsider Marina Oswald's denial. Just a few days later, on March 26th, Oswald received notice that Marina had finally been approved for travel to the U.S. The obvious questions raised by the circumstances of Marina's case are, why did the State Department care enough to escalate Marina's case up the ladder to the INS, and why did the INS commissioner bypass the law to make it all happen? On September 13, 1960, Lee Harvey Oswald had his Marine Corps discharge status changed from discharge for dependency to undesirable. Oswald did not like this decision at all and took a lot of steps to get that discharge change reversed. On January of 1962, he wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, John Connally, the same John Connally that would end up being shot along with President John Kennedy in Dallas in November of 1963. Connally had appointed Todd as post by his longtime mentor, and then Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Oswald wanted his discharge to be reversed. Connolly's office wrote back on February 23, 1962, explaining that he was no longer the Secretary of the Navy and that he should contact the new Navy Secretary Fred Court. Remember us mentioning Edwin Excel, Marguerite Oswald's second husband? Well, it turns out that in those divorce proceedings, Edwin Excel's attorney was none other than Fred Court. I mean, this menagerie of coincidences just can't get any stranger. Back-to-back Secretaries of the Navy both had connections to Lee Harvey Oswald. Who'da thunk? We discussed fellow defector Robert Webster earlier in the context of his claim to having met Marina in Moscow in 1959. It turns out that Moscow wasn't the only time Marina visited Webster, according to him. Webster, who lived in Leningrad, which is where Marina was from, applied for an exit visa from the Soviet Union in the fall of 1960, which was denied. He was told to reapply in a year. Marina was working in Minsk at the time and took a vacation home to Leningrad, which is today known as St. Petersburg, which is about 12 hours away from Minsk. This was all before she met Oswald. Marina didn't tell the Warren Commission who she was visiting on this trip, but she told the FBI that she met Lev Privistev, and the FBI found that name in one of her notebooks. When the FBI looked into who this guy was, they discovered that he lived in the same apartment block as Robert Webster. Privistev was in apartment 7 and Webster was in number 18. Webster confirmed to author Dick Russell that he did see Marina for a second time in Leningrad. They spoke to one another in English when they were together. So Oswald and Webster both defected a few months apart from each other in 1959 on a Saturday when U.S. Embassy offices were officially closed, had potentially sensitive information. Were befriended by Marina Persakova, and both men returned to the U.S. in the spring of 1962. What are the chances of all that lining up by some random happenstance? In a country as big as the Soviet Union, this one woman just happened to meet and hook up with 2 of the 3 American men who had defected to Russia during this period of time. Hollywood screenwriters couldn't dream up this kind of stuff if they tried. Okay, that concludes this episode of Oswald's time in Russia, and we will be having one more episode to pretty much clean up a few loose ends and bring it all together as best we can. I would ask that you hit the like button if you like the content we are presenting and subscribe if you haven't already done so. We shall see you all in the next one. And remember, stay happy and remain curious.